They said it was for my safety, that I'd thank them later. But what kind of safety requires theft? That's what I asked myself the morning I found the empty space in the driveway where my car used to be. The faint rectangle of oil stain still marking the spot like a ghost that hadn't realized it was gone. The lilac bush beside it leaned toward the light in the same way it always had. The mailbox still rattled when the wind hit from the north, and yet everything looked rearranged, off-kilter, as if the world itself had been tilted slightly to accommodate the absence. My son, Daniel, had called the night before. He'd sounded cheerful in that clipped professional way he adopts when he's trying to make something sound reasonable. He told me not to worry, that things were being taken care of, that at my age it was important to simplify, to delegate. He said the word delegate like it was an act of love. I went to bed uneasy, but told myself not to be paranoid, that he was probably talking about the property taxes or maybe the leak under the kitchen sink. But when I woke up and looked out the window, my car, my old faithful green Honda Accord, was gone. The first thing I did was check with the neighbors, though I already knew the answer. I didn't need anyone to tell me that my own family had done this. You don't forget that particular flavor of violation, the kind that smells like protection, but tastes like control. I'm 82 years old. I live alone in a duplex I bought myself 10 years ago after my husband passed. It's small, one floor, nothing grand. Just enough for me, my plants, and the radio that crackles softly every morning when I make coffee. I don't need care. I don't even like the word. It's become code for erasure, for decisions made in soft voices just out of earshot, for signatures placed on forms you never got to read. I have arthritis, yes. My knees are slower than they used to be, and sometimes I forget where I left my glasses. But I'm not lost. I'm not incapable. My mind is still mine. My habits still my own. And that car, it wasn't a relic. It was freedom on 4 wheels. I drove it every Tuesday to the lake 30 miles away, where I'd sit under the same willow tree and read. Sometimes I wouldn't even open the book. I'd just watch the water. The car was the only space where no one was talking over me, no one telling me what I could or couldn't handle. When I called Daniel, I already knew he wouldn't pick up. He rarely does on the first try. He likes to let calls ring so he can decide whether he's in the mood to sound patient. I left a message. Daniel, the car's missing. Please call me back. I didn't say stolen, because the word felt too heavy, too final. But in the silence that followed, I could feel the word taking shape anyway. An hour later, he texted instead of calling. Mom, we sold it. It was time. The money's in your account for your care expenses. You're welcome. That was all. No apology, no explanation, just a bureaucratic announcement wrapped in the language of benevolence. For your care. As if care were a product I'd ordered and forgotten about. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, the message glowing on the screen like an insult that refused to fade. The curtains were half drawn, the morning light pale and indecisive, and for a moment I felt the strangest sensation, that I had slipped out of my own life, that somewhere, out there, a different version of me still existed, the one who could drive, decide, insist, the one whose son didn't treat her like an account to be managed. I tried to imagine what Daniel had told himself to make it feel okay. Maybe he pictured me as fragile, confused, lost at intersections. Maybe he convinced himself he was saving me from danger. People love to imagine themselves as saviors, especially when they're taking something they have no right to. It wasn't just a car. It was the last thing that was entirely mine. After my husband Peter died, the house we'd lived in for 40 years became too much, too heavy with memory and maintenance. I sold it and bought this smaller place outright. Cash from the sale, no debt, no help from anyone. Daniel helped with the move, of course, organized boxes, hired cleaners, took over the bills temporarily until I got settled. I didn't notice back then how many of my own decisions quietly became his. The cable company was suddenly in his name, the insurance policy adjusted for convenience, my bank account linked to his for automatic payments. It all sounded so harmless at the time, so logical. Only now do I see it for what it was, a slow, polite takeover disguised as filial duty. I keep remembering the day we bought the Honda, Peter and I. It was 1998. The dealership smelled of tires and burnt coffee, and Peter was haggling over the price with a salesman half his age. He turned to me and said, "You drive more than I do. You pick the color." I chose green, a deep forest shade that looked black at night. It became our travel car, our argument car, our makeup car. When he got sick, I drove it to every doctor's appointment. After he died, I drove it to his grave for months just to talk to him. When I turned 70, Daniel said maybe it was time to stop driving. I told him I'd stop when I stopped living. We laughed then. It doesn't sound funny anymore. Now, sitting in my kitchen surrounded by the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock, I realize that what they've taken isn't transportation. It's witness. That car saw me through every version of myself: wife, mother, widow, woman alone. It carried the groceries and the silence, the tears and the relief of returning home. To sell it without asking was to erase the evidence of my continuity, to declare me a dependent, not a person. When Daniel said, "It's for your care," what he meant was, "We've decided you're no longer capable of choice." I called the bank next. They confirmed the transfer. A deposit labeled asset liquidation, family authorization. The phrase made my skin crawl. I asked the woman on the phone what that meant exactly. She hesitated, lowered her voice, and said, "It means your son signed off on it. The title was under joint ownership." I almost laughed. Of course it was. I remembered the day he convinced me to add his name for insurance purposes in case something happened to me. Something had, apparently. After I hung up, I walked outside. The air was thin, brittle with early autumn. A neighbor waved from her porch, and I waved back like nothing was wrong. There's a strange dignity in pretending you're fine when you've just been betrayed. It gives you time to think. I walked down the driveway, past the empty space, to the corner of the street. Without the car there, the house looked exposed, smaller somehow. I realized then that everything my family had been doing, the simplifying, the rearranging, the taking care, wasn't about my safety at all. It was about making me manageable, reducing me into a set of needs they could quantify and control. It's easier to pity someone when you've already stripped them of authority. When I went back inside, I brewed a new pot of coffee and sat with my checkbook open. I still balance it by hand, out of habit. The pages were neat, columns aligned, my handwriting steady. I wanted to see in ink what I already knew in my bones, that I was still capable. My pen didn't tremble. The arithmetic still made sense. That small proof of order soothed me more than anything Daniel could ever say. I'm not angry, not yet. Anger implies surprise, and I've learned that betrayal is rarely sudden. It's the last drop after years of quiet pouring. Later that afternoon, I opened the drawer where I keep the spare key. It was still there, cool and familiar in my palm, a useless relic now. I turned it over in my hand and thought about what it meant to lose something that had always come with me. The key itself had weight, more than the metal should have, as if it still held the memory of the ignition, the hum of the engine, the road stretching ahead. I placed it back in the drawer carefully, as though it were a small body that deserved respect. I'm not sentimental by nature, but grief has a way of teaching you how to handle what's gone. By evening, Daniel called. His voice was calm, patronizing. "Mom, I hope you're not upset. The car wasn't safe anymore. We just didn't want you to get hurt. We're trying to look out for you." I listened quietly, waiting for the part where he'd remember I was the one who raised him, the one who'd driven him to every school play, every emergency room visit, every job interview. That part never came. Instead, he said, "This way you can focus on what matters. We'll handle the rest." I wanted to ask, "The rest of what?" But I didn't. I hung up and wrote his words on a scrap of paper, then tore it in half. So that's where I am now. 82, alone, unhurt, but humiliated, surrounded by the trappings of care I never asked for. They sold my car to pay for my care, but I don't need care. I need my car back. I need the sound of tires on asphalt, the smell of rain on the windshield, the small, steady joy of choosing where to go and when. I need to be trusted with my own life, even if it ends in a ditch. Because the truth is, danger never frightened me half as much as pity does. And as I sit here, looking out at the empty driveway, I know one thing with absolute clarity. They've underestimated the wrong old woman. It began, as betrayals often do, not with a single moment of cruelty, but with a document printed in polite language. A week after they sold my car, an envelope arrived in the mail. It was addressed to me, but in Daniel's handwriting, careful and overly formal, the way he writes when he's pretending to be reasonable. Inside was a printed statement from an estate management service I had never heard of, with my name typed neatly beside his under the heading Joint Financial Guardianship Agreement. I read it twice before I even understood what I was looking at. The letter explained that due to my age and evolving care needs, my son had been appointed as co-signatory and financial administrator for certain non-essential assets. That phrase alone, non-essential assets, made something twist inside my chest. My car, my savings, my independence, my name on a bank account, all of it reduced to an inventory of manageable inconveniences. There was a cheerful note at the bottom, signed by someone named Rebecca, a family advisor, thanking me for my trust in our process. I hadn't given anyone my trust. They'd taken it, notarized it, and mailed me the receipt. I called Daniel immediately. He didn't answer. I called again and again, until finally he picked up with that sigh he saves for me, the one that sounds like patience worn thin. "Mom, I was going to explain all of that this weekend," he said, like I'd ruined the timing of some well-rehearsed reveal. "It's just paperwork. Legal protection in case something happens. Everyone does this." He sounded confident, rehearsed, as if he had practiced every sentence in front of the mirror. "You forged my signature," I said quietly. There was a pause, a short breath, and then the tone of his voice changed, softening into that syrupy mixture of concern and control. "Mom, no one forged anything. You must have signed something last year when we set up the automatic payments. You probably don't remember." That was the line that did it. That small, calculated sentence slipped so smoothly into the conversation, as if it were reasonable to accuse me of forgetting my own consent. I didn't shout, not even when I wanted to. I just said, "I remember everything." He told me to calm down, that stress wasn't good for me, that I was spiraling. I listened to the language, to the way every phrase was chosen to sound like care, while meaning the opposite. It wasn't that he hated me. It's that he'd rebranded my existence as a logistical burden to be managed. "You'll thank me when you see how much easier things are," he said. "I'm taking the pressure off you. You don't have to worry about bills or maintenance or any of that nonsense. We'll handle it. You just focus on enjoying life." Enjoying life, as if joy were possible without autonomy. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the words from the document glowing behind my eyes. Guardianship, evolving care needs, protection. They read like a diagnosis, a quiet declaration that I had already been moved from the category of person to the category of dependent. I sat at the kitchen table with my old box of receipts, the ones Daniel had told me years ago to throw away their clutter. I sorted through them anyway. There were invoices from the car dealership, repair receipts, insurance renewals, even an old registration slip from the first year Peter and I bought the car. Each paper carried the faint trace of my signature, my own looping handwriting that now someone dared to imitate. I ran my fingers along the ink, as if I could touch the part of myself that had once been unquestioned. The next morning, I went to the credit union downtown. The clerk behind the counter, a woman maybe in her 40s with kind eyes and nervous hands, looked surprised to see someone my age asking to review recent transactions. I gave her my account number and ID, and she frowned slightly at the screen. "It looks like there's been some consolidation activity," she said carefully. "Joint account adjustments, asset transfers, and a service fee from BrightCare Financial." I asked what BrightCare was. She hesitated. "It's a senior management trust, usually set up for clients who need help managing their assets. They have authorization from your cosigner." My cosigner, my son. "Can I get a printed statement?" I asked. She looked uneasy. "Technically, I have to get approval before printing a full summary, but..." She lowered her voice. "If you tell them you never consented, I can mark the account for review. It triggers an internal audit." I nodded. "Do that," I said. My voice didn't shake. When I got home, I found a voicemail from my daughter-in-law, Claire. Her tone was bright and brittle, the way people speak when they're about to say something cruel but want to sound gentle. "Hi, Mom. I just wanted to let you know that we're moving forward with the care consultation next week. Don't worry, it's not a big deal. Just an assessment to see what kind of support you might need long-term. They'll probably ask you a few questions about your daily routine, medication, memory. It's all very standard." I replayed it twice, just to hear the word memory again, how carefully she enunciated it, like a warning dressed as a kindness. They were staging an intervention disguised as concern, and I was expected to play along, to sit quietly, while strangers measured my competence like a pulse. I spent the next few days in a state of cold, lucid fury. I didn't cry, not once. Anger, when it comes late in life, doesn't look like shouting. It looks like a woman making lists. I wrote down every transaction, every conversation, every date. I printed Daniel's text messages, his emails, even the automatic notices from the care coordinator I'd never met. I didn't know exactly what I was building, but I knew it was a record, a witness, something that would outlive their version of events. I called the number from the letter, BrightCare Financial, and asked for the file associated with my name. The woman on the line said she wasn't authorized to release it without the primary administrator's consent. That would be my son, I said. Yes, she replied cheerfully. We can copy him on any requests. I smiled into the receiver. Please don't. I'll handle this myself. That night, I found the title of my car online in the state database. It listed Daniel as co-owner. The sale had been processed 3 days earlier for $4,800. The note read, "Funds allocated to long-term care planning." I laughed then, a sound that surprised even me. Low, sharp, humorless. I imagined them congratulating themselves for their efficiency, believing they were securing my future while selling off my past. It's a strange thing, realizing your child has come to see you not as a parent, but as a liability wrapped in nostalgia. I suppose it happened slowly, the shift from mom to her. The next morning, I drove my neighbor's daughter, Leah, to her shift at the pharmacy. She's 23, shy, still half apologizing for existing, but she offered me her keys without question when I told her I needed to run an errand. You can drive? She asked. I smiled. Can, will, and must. The steering wheel felt familiar, no matter the make or model. I drove to the municipal records office, a small beige building that smelled of toner and resignation. I waited in line behind a man arguing about a parking ticket, and when it was my turn, I told the clerk I needed to review a property and vehicle sale under my name. He asked for ID, typed a few things, then looked up with professional caution. It says here you're under a limited financial care arrangement. You'll need your representative's signature to access these records. My representative. The word stung more than I expected. I leaned closer and said quietly, "There is no representative. I'm here. I represent myself." He looked at me for a long moment, and then, maybe out of pity or respect or both, he printed the page anyway. "You didn't get this from me," he said. Outside, the air was sharp, the kind that tastes like change. I sat in the car and read the document slowly. It confirmed everything: the sale authorization, the deposit to Bright Care, the note signed in Daniel's digital signature. They had made me legally incompetent on paper without ever saying the word aloud. That was the real betrayal. Not the sale itself, not even the money, but the quiet rewriting of who I was. They had taken my name and filled it with their intentions. When I got home, I placed the printout on the kitchen counter and stared at it until the words blurred. I thought about calling Daniel again, demanding an explanation. But what would be the point? He'd just say it was for my protection, that he loved me, that I should be grateful. The language of love, when used by those who want control, becomes indistinguishable from threat. Instead, I took out a clean sheet of paper and wrote a single sentence. I do not consent to any guardianship, financial or otherwise. I signed my full name beneath it, in pen so dark it bled through the page, and then I folded it and slipped it into the folder with my receipts. It wasn't a legal document yet, but it was something, a declaration, a small act of rebellion. That was the moment the shift began, though I didn't know it then. The catalyst wasn't the sale of the car or the forged signature. It was the realization that I had been written out of my own story. And if they could rewrite it once, they could do it again, unless I took back the pen. So I sat there, 82 years old, surrounded by papers and silence, and I made myself a quiet promise. They had taken my car, my money, my supposed safety, but they hadn't taken my voice. Not yet. And before this was over, I intended to make sure it was heard, loud enough that even Daniel, with all his careful words and polished excuses, would have to listen. For a while after that day, everything around me seemed to move with an exaggerated politeness, as though the world itself had been instructed not to alarm me. Daniel began calling every other evening, always from the car on his way home, the hum of traffic behind his voice, giving him the convenient excuse to end the call whenever he wished. He would ask whether I'd taken my medication, whether I was eating properly, whether I'd remembered to turn off the stove. They were the sort of questions people ask children or invalids, and I answered them calmly because that was easier than fighting. But each question was another small subtraction, another way of carving away the edges of the person I used to be. He had begun speaking to me in that measured, sing-song tone people use with the elderly in waiting rooms. Calm, patronizing, unbearably slow. It wasn't cruelty. It was worse than cruelty. It was management disguised as tenderness. And the more politely he spoke, the more invisible I became. It started to show up in other ways. My mail began arriving already opened, the envelopes slit cleanly at the top. Daniel said he had arranged for mail forwarding and safety screening because there were too many scams targeting seniors. He told me it was for my peace of mind. My prescriptions were now delivered automatically by courier, the labels bearing both our names, as though I were sharing my bloodstream with him. Then there was the care assessment Claire mentioned. I received a call from a woman named Janice, who introduced herself as a senior well-being consultant. She spoke in rehearsed sentences that began with, "at your age," and ended with, "we just want what's best." She asked if she could visit me at home for an informal conversation. When I told her I didn't need or want a consultation, she laughed softly, as though I had made a charming mistake. "It's not optional, dear. Your family already scheduled it." The day Janice arrived, she came armed with a clipboard and the kind of smile people reserve for hospice visits. She walked slowly through my house, commenting on tripping hazards, on the height of the cabinets, on the absence of handrails. Every observation was written down with the same faint scratch of her pen, and with each mark I felt the walls closing in. When she asked how often I drove, I told her that I used to drive every day until my son sold my car without asking. She paused, pen in midair, then wrote something quickly before changing the subject. By the time she left, she had filled out 5 pages of notes and left behind a glossy pamphlet titled "Living Safely at Any Age." The cover showed a white-haired couple smiling over a salad, as if lettuce were a life plan. I dropped it straight into the recycling bin, but that didn't stop the follow-up letter that arrived a week later, recommending part-time companionship care. The term made my stomach turn. It was the bureaucratic way of saying babysitter. It's strange how humiliation accumulates. It doesn't strike like lightning. It seeps, drop by drop, until one day you wake up drenched in it. That's how it was for me. Every day, another small reminder that I was being filed away somewhere between incapable and irrelevant. When I went to renew my insurance, the clerk informed me that my policy had been converted to a dependent coverage plan, my son listed as the primary contact. When I called the electric company about an outage, the automated system refused to speak with me until I entered a code Daniel had set up for authorized users. Even my doctor, whom I'd known for 20 years, began calling Daniel with updates before he called me. I became a spectator in my own life, watching other people narrate my existence as if I had already stepped aside. I began to notice how the language around me had changed. Words like help and support were everywhere, but never choice. Even my friends, well-meaning women from the neighborhood, started repeating his phrases. "You're lucky, you know," said Ellen one afternoon when I told her what was happening. "Most kids these days don't bother. At least he's looking out for you. I smiled because there was no point arguing. But later, when she left, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the cooling cup of tea she'd forgotten. Lucky. That word followed me for days. It's a clever kind of cruelty to convince someone that their captivity is a blessing. And then came the credit card incident. One evening, I tried to order groceries online, something I'd done countless times before, but my card was declined. I called the bank, expecting a simple explanation. Instead, the woman told me that the account had been temporarily frozen for security reasons, and that the authorization now required co-approval from the joint holder. She meant Daniel. I asked how such a thing was possible without my consent, and she said, "It happens often, ma'am. It's called protective oversight." Protective oversight. Two words that managed to sound both kind and suffocating. I hung up before I said something I'd regret. That night, I sat in the dark living room with the lights off, listening to the refrigerator hum, and tried to remember when exactly I'd stopped being treated as someone to respect and started being treated as a potential emergency. The next day, Claire showed up unannounced. She was carrying a casserole dish and that brittle smile she wears when she's pretending to like me. "We thought you might appreciate some company," she said, glancing around as though inspecting for dust. She told me Daniel was busy at work, but wanted her to check in. Make sure everything's running smoothly. The phrase made me laugh out loud. "I didn't realize my life was an appliance," I said. She didn't answer, just set the dish on the counter and started rearranging things. When she opened the cupboard and began moving my mugs, I felt something hot rise in my chest. "Leave them," I said, maybe too sharply. She froze, mug in hand, eyes wide. "I was just trying to help." I nodded slowly. "Yes, that's the problem. You all keep trying to help." After she left, I found myself standing at the window, hands trembling. The quiet of the house pressed against me like a heavy fabric. Outside, the street was calm. The same neighbor walking her dog, the same children on bicycles, the same postman making his rounds. To anyone looking in, I was just another old woman at home on a weekday afternoon. But inside, everything had shifted. I could feel it. The slow erosion of my life. The steady transformation from person to possession. It's a peculiar loneliness, realizing that the people you love have mistaken control for care. I started going for long walks just to remind myself that I could still decide where to place my feet. I walked without purpose, through neighborhoods I'd never visited, down streets that curved away from memory. Once, I passed a small used car lot on the edge of town. There were rows of vehicles lined up like soldiers awaiting orders, their windshields streaked with dust and sunlight. I stood at the fence for a long time, looking at them. The owner, a man in grease-stained overalls, came out and asked if I was looking to buy. "Not yet," I said, "but soon." It was the first time in weeks I'd spoken a sentence that belonged entirely to me. The next escalation came quietly, disguised as convenience. Daniel called to tell me he'd hired a home assistant to help with errands and appointments. "Just a few hours a week," he said. "She'll drive you where you need to go." I told him I didn't need anyone to drive me, and he said, "Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be." Harder for whom, I wondered. When the assistant arrived, a young woman named Tessa, she was polite but distant, like a nurse on her first day. She offered to help with groceries, with cleaning, with scheduling doctor visits. I told her I was fine. She smiled mechanically and began dusting the shelves anyway. Watching her handle my belongings with gloved efficiency felt obscene. After she left, the house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and intrusion. A few days later, I found a new device on the counter, small, white, and blinking. "It's a safety monitor," Daniel explained when I called him. "It detects falls and sends alerts. Totally standard." I unplugged it that night and shoved it in the drawer, but the next morning he noticed. "Why is the signal offline?" he asked. I lied and said the power must have gone out. He said he'd send someone to fix it. The next day, Tessa reappeared with another monitor, this one equipped with a camera. She placed it discreetly on a shelf and told me not to worry. It was just to make everyone feel secure. Everyone but me. That was when I stopped sleeping properly. The house felt like it had eyes. I started moving through the rooms in silence, avoiding the camera's line of sight, whispering to myself out of habit rather than madness. There's a point at which care becomes surveillance, and I had crossed it. One night, while I sat awake at 3 a.m, I realized that what I feared most wasn't losing control. It was forgetting what control felt like. I took out the papers I'd gathered, the receipts, the letters, the bank statements, and spread them across the kitchen table. They looked like evidence from someone else's life. But no, they were mine, and they were going to save me. The next morning, I visited the library, the only place left that still smelled like freedom. Paper, dust, and quiet. I used one of the public computers to research elder rights, guardianship laws, financial abuse. The language was cold but clear, and buried among the legal jargon were phrases that felt like tiny lifelines. Revocable authority, undue influence, exploitation. I printed everything I could afford and hid the pages inside an old cookbook so no one would notice. I wasn't ready to fight yet, but I was preparing, the way a tree prepares for a storm by deepening its roots. When I returned home, another letter awaited me. This one was from BrightCare again, confirming my enrollment in a transitional care program. It said representatives would contact me soon to finalize relocation logistics. Relocation, such a gentle word for exile. I read it 3 times, each time slower, until the meaning settled like ice in my stomach. They were planning to move me, probably into one of those cheerful facilities where the walls smell of disinfectant and old grief. It was no longer hypothetical. They were building a world without me in it. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the maple trees, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my knees and tried to think. The neighborhood was quiet except for the faint rumble of cars in the distance. I imagined my old Honda among them, still out there somewhere, carrying someone else toward their version of freedom. The thought didn't make me sad. It made me determined. They thought they'd stripped me of options, but they'd only forced me to remember what self-preservation looks like. It isn't loud or dramatic. It's methodical, patient, and when it comes, it's unstoppable. I went inside, locked the door, and wrote one more note for myself in the same notebook where I'd begun keeping records. They think I've gone quiet because I'm tired. I'm quiet because I'm planning. I closed the notebook carefully, the way one might close a loaded weapon, and set it on the nightstand. The house around me was still, almost serene. For the first time in months, I didn't feel watched. I felt ready. They had pushed me into silence, thinking it meant surrender. But silence, when chosen, is just another form of power waiting to be spoken aloud. The shift began quietly, without a single moment of revelation, only a slow gathering of resolve that felt almost physical, as if the air around me had thickened and was now pushing me forward. It happened the morning I walked to the DMV, of all places, a building I had avoided for years because of its endless lines and flickering fluorescent lights. I remember standing at the bus stop, clutching my handbag like it contained the last piece of proof that I was real, and thinking how strange it was to feel both terrified and completely calm at once. The bus was late. The sky was pale with early winter light, and I was surrounded by people who looked through me as if I were transparent. When it arrived, I climbed the steps slowly, paid in exact change, and sat by the window. It had been months since I'd been that far from home without permission. The city looked different now, meaner around the edges, as though even the trees had given up trying to be green. But inside me there was a kind of steadiness, an almost electric clarity that made every sound sharper. I was going to prove, if not to them, then at least to myself, that I still existed as a person who could act, decide, and be accountable. The DMV smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, exactly as I remembered. I took a ticket from the machine and waited. Around me, people sighed, argued softly, checked their phones, children tugged at their parents' coats. It was ordinary, beautifully ordinary, and I found comfort in that. When my number was called, I approached the counter where a young man with a neat beard and an expression of trained boredom greeted me without looking up. I told him I wanted to renew my driver's license. He asked for my ID, my old license, and proof of address. I handed them over. His fingers froze on the keyboard for a moment, then he frowned. "It says here your license is on hold pending medical review." I felt my pulse quicken. "A medical review? I never requested one." He shrugged slightly. "Says it was filed by your family representative for safety evaluation." I could feel the blood rising to my face. "There is no representative. I'm here. I'm fine." He glanced up then, and for the first time really looked at me. There was something in his expression, not pity, not suspicion, but recognition, as though he understood more than he could say. He typed something quickly, then asked me to take a vision test. I passed easily. When it was over, he smiled faintly and said, "You're good, ma'am. I'll mark this as cleared. You'll get your renewal in the mail." I thanked him quietly, holding back the tears that threatened to come not from sadness, but from vindication. On the way home, the bus was half empty. I sat by the window again, watching the city blur by, and felt a curious lightness. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was the slow return of a voice I thought I had lost. That small plastic card would be proof, not to Daniel, not to any bureaucrat, but to myself, that I was still licensed to move through the world under my own name. That evening, I made myself a proper dinner for the first time in months, salmon and roasted vegetables, poured a glass of wine, and ate it at the kitchen table without turning on the television. The silence felt companionable now, not oppressive. The next morning, I gathered everything I had been saving: the statements, the forged documents, the BrightCare letters, the notes from the so-called well-being consultant. I spread them across the table in careful rows, each one a piece of the puzzle that formed the picture of my erasure. I had been waiting for someone to notice, for a neighbor or a doctor or a friend to say, "This isn't right." But no one would, because to them it looked like kindness. So I decided I would have to be my own witness. I found a number in the back of one of the pamphlets I'd printed at the library, Legal Aid for Seniors. I called and explained calmly and clearly that I suspected unauthorized guardianship and financial exploitation. The woman on the phone asked for details, and I told her everything. The car sale, the forged signature, the restricted accounts. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then she said, "You did the right thing by calling. Do you have documentation?" "Every piece," I said. She scheduled an appointment for the following week and told me to bring copies of everything. The days leading up to that appointment felt like a strange kind of waiting, but not the helpless kind. I spent my mornings walking again, my afternoons sorting papers, my evenings writing down everything I could remember. The house no longer felt like a cage. It was a command center. Each drawer, each folder, each note was a line of defense being drawn quietly in pencil before the battle began. When Daniel called, I let the phone ring. When Claire left another cheerful voicemail about the upcoming move, I deleted it without listening to the end. They thought I was retreating, but I was gathering. On the morning of the appointment, I dressed carefully, choosing my navy coat, the same one I had worn on my wedding anniversary dinner years ago, and the silver brooch Peter had given me on our 50th. I wanted to look like what I was, a woman who still knew her own worth. The legal aid office was small but bright, tucked between a florist and a tax service. The attorney who met me was named Evelyn, a compact woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a voice that carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen too much. She listened without interrupting as I laid out the papers on her desk. Occasionally, she nodded. Occasionally, she asked a question, but mostly she just let me speak. When I was done, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Mrs. Harlow, what's been done to you is not uncommon, but it's still illegal. They've executed a de facto guardianship without due process." I asked what that meant exactly, and she explained that I still had every right to challenge it, that the car sale could be contested, that the financial authorizations could be revoked. "But you have to be prepared," she said. "Once you file, it becomes a fight." I told her I had been preparing for months without realizing it. She smiled then, a small, approving curve of the mouth. "Good," she said, "because you're about to remind them who they're dealing with." She helped me draft a petition to revoke the unauthorized guardianship and reclaim the proceeds from the car sale. She explained that I'd need to file it at the county courthouse, that I would have to stand before a judge and speak for myself. The thought made my stomach twist, but also, strangely, it made me feel alive. I left her office with a folder of forms and a sense of purpose so sharp it almost hurt. On the bus ride home, I caught my reflection in the window. My face looked older than I remembered. Thinner, maybe, but my eyes were steady. For the first time in a long while, I recognized the woman looking back at me. I wasn't a patient or a problem or a fragile relic from a previous generation. I was someone who had built a life from the ground up and was now reclaiming the right to keep it. That evening, I wrote in my notebook, "Power isn't given back. It's taken when they're not looking." Over the next week, small things began to change inside me. When Tessa, the home assistant, arrived for her scheduled visit, I greeted her at the door and told her politely that her services were no longer required. She blinked, uncertain, then said she'd have to confirm with Daniel. "You do that," I said, and closed the door behind her. When the care coordinator called, I let her message go unanswered. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided not to listen. Each refusal felt like a breath drawn after too long underwater. Then, one afternoon, Daniel showed up unannounced. He stood on my porch, holding a paper bag from the grocery store, his expression a mixture of concern and irritation. "Mom, we need to talk," he said. I didn't invite him in right away. For a moment, we just stood there, the distance between us heavier than ever. Finally, I stepped aside. He put the bag on the counter, unpacking items I hadn't asked for: soup, protein drinks, multivitamins, and began to talk in that careful, reasonable voice again. He said he'd noticed some confusion with the accounts, that the bank had called him, that I shouldn't be taking things so personally. I listened, arms folded. Then I asked him to sit down. When he did, I placed a copy of the petition on the table between us. He read the first few lines, then looked up sharply. "What is this?" "It's my life," I said, "and I'm taking it back." For a moment, I thought he might actually apologize. Instead, he sighed and rubbed his temples. "Mom, you're making this harder than it needs to be." I almost laughed. Harder for who? He didn't answer. When he left, he didn't hug me. I watched his car pull away and felt something inside me unclench. There was no going back now. That night, I sat by the window with the petition in my lap, reading the lines over and over. The words were dry, legalistic, but beneath them pulsed something alive, a heartbeat of resistance. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, one by one, and I thought about how long it had been since I'd seen the world from behind a windshield, how much I missed the small freedoms most people never think about. Soon, I promised myself. Soon, I would drive again, even if it was only around the block. I went to bed with the faintest sense of anticipation, like the night before a long journey. The silence of the house no longer frightened me. It felt expectant, almost companionable, as though the walls themselves understood that something irreversible had begun. When I closed my eyes, I saw the reflection of my old green Honda in the driveway, waiting patiently under the streetlight. It wasn't really there, of course, but the image steadied me. It reminded me that freedom, once learned, never truly leaves you. It just waits for you to remember the way back. The call from the courthouse came on a Tuesday morning that began like any other, with the small rituals that made my days bearable: boiling water for tea, opening the curtains, turning the radio on just loud enough to hear the weather report. The voice on the line was professional, almost neutral. "Mrs. Harlow, your petition has been approved for hearing. The date is set for the 17th, 9 a.m., courtroom 3. For a moment I couldn't answer. I just stood there with the receiver pressed against my ear, feeling the thrum of blood in my temples. The words sounded enormous, too formal for the small kitchen they now filled. I thanked her, wrote down the time and location, and hung up. Then I sat for a long while staring at the piece of paper where I had written it. I hadn't expected it to happen so soon. The thought of standing before a judge both terrified and exhilarated me. It felt like stepping onto a stage you hadn't auditioned for, but had spent a lifetime preparing to occupy. That same afternoon, Daniel appeared again, as if summoned by some invisible signal. He arrived with the same tense smile, the one that always made me think of a closed door. "I got an email," he said before I could even greet him. "From some legal aid thing. Are you really doing this?" He didn't sit down, didn't even take off his coat. He just stood there, vibrating with restrained indignation. I told him yes, I was. He looked at me like he didn't recognize me. "Mom, this is absurd. You're making a spectacle of yourself. People will think you're confused." I said I wasn't confused, just awake. His jaw tightened. "You're going to regret this. You're putting the family in a terrible position." That was the moment I realized how little he understood. He thought this was about embarrassment, about appearances, about the illusion of harmony that he and Claire curated like a social media feed. I told him calmly that the hearing was happening, with or without his blessing. His voice cracked on the next words. "You're ruining everything we've done for you." I laughed, quietly, because I couldn't help it. "You mean everything you've done to me." After he left, I found myself shaking. Not from fear, but from the aftershock of confrontation. It had been years since I'd spoken to him with that kind of finality. There's a peculiar grief that comes with realizing your child sees your independence as defiance, your clarity as confusion. I walked through the house slowly, touching objects as though to steady myself. The photo of Peter on the bookshelf, the chipped teacup from our honeymoon, the vase I'd bought at a garage sale 30 years ago. These things had survived decades without anyone needing to supervise them, and so had I. That night, I couldn't sleep, my mind rehearsing every possible version of the hearing. I imagined the judge, the lawyers, the dull shuffle of papers, and I promised myself that no matter what happened, I would not let them speak over me again. The days leading up to the court date blurred together in a haze of preparation and dread. Evelyn called twice to go over my statement. She told me what to expect, how to stay calm, how to let the documents speak first. Judges like order, she said. They like facts, not feelings. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Facts were my armor now, even if every one of them had been paid for in small humiliations. The night before the hearing, I ironed my navy coat again and laid out my papers on the dining table like soldiers ready for inspection. The house was silent, except for the sound of wind moving through the branches outside. I thought of Peter, of what he would have said. Probably something simple, something steady, like, "Stand straight, Marnie. They can't shrink you unless you let them." I whispered the words aloud as though saying them could conjure his presence. The morning of the hearing was cold and clear, the kind of day that demands resolve. I arrived early, my stomach in knots, the courthouse looming ahead like an indifferent giant. The security guard at the entrance smiled politely as he checked my bag. Inside, the building smelled of dust, paper, and nerves. I found courtroom 3 easily enough and sat on the wooden bench outside, clutching the folder to my chest. When Evelyn arrived, she greeted me with a nod and that brisk confidence that people who live in courtrooms wear like armor. "You ready?" she asked. "As I'll ever be," I said. When the doors opened, the room was half empty, rows of benches gleaming under fluorescent light. At the front, the judge, a woman with silver hair pulled into a bun, was already seated, reviewing papers. She looked up briefly as we entered, her expression unreadable. On the opposite side sat Daniel and Claire, both in dark suits that looked borrowed from someone else's idea of adulthood. Daniel avoided my eyes. Claire offered a faint, nervous smile that I did not return. Evelyn guided me to the table and began arranging the documents with meticulous care. When the clerk called the case, the air seemed to tighten. The judge asked us to state our names for the record, and then it began. Evelyn spoke first, her voice measured and precise, explaining how my assets had been sold without consent, how guardianship had been executed through forged or coerced documentation. She laid out the evidence one piece at a time: the car sale, the bank transfers, the authorization letters. The judge listened without interruption, only nodding occasionally, her pen tapping softly against the desk. When Evelyn finished, Daniel's attorney, a man I'd never seen before, younger than my grandson, rose to speak. He began by complimenting the family's devotion and concern for my welfare. "Mr. Harlow has acted purely out of love," he said, "in accordance with medical and financial advice to ensure his mother's well-being." His voice was smooth, almost oily. Then he gestured toward me. "With respect, Mrs. Harlow's recent actions demonstrate a certain impulsivity, perhaps confusion, which only reinforces the need for continued oversight." The words landed like pebbles thrown against a window, sharp, small, relentless. I could feel the judge's eyes on me, measuring, assessing. Evelyn whispered, "Don't react." But something in me snapped. I stood up before she could stop me. My voice came out clear and steady, surprising even me. "I am not confused," I said. The attorney blinked, startled. "I am angry. There's a difference." The judge raised a hand, motioning for silence, but then she looked at me and said, "Go ahead, Mrs. Harlow." So I did. I told them about the car, about the letters, about the signatures I never gave and the choices taken from me. I told them how it felt to wake up one day and find yourself erased from your own life. My voice didn't shake, though my hands did. I could see Daniel's expression shifting. First embarrassment, then something like guilt, then exhaustion. When I finished, the judge was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Harlow. That will do." The rest of the proceedings passed in a blur of paperwork and procedural language, but I remember the judge's final words clearly. "This court finds insufficient evidence to justify guardianship. All restrictions are to be lifted. The sale of the vehicle is deemed unauthorized, and restitution is ordered." She paused then, looking directly at me. "Mrs. Harlow, you are within your rights to manage your own affairs. I suggest you consider new legal representation to protect them moving forward." I nodded, unable to speak. Daniel's shoulders slumped as if someone had removed the air from his lungs. Claire reached for his hand, but he didn't take it. Evelyn squeezed my arm gently. "You did it," she whispered. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, cleaner somehow. The sky was a pale blue so clear it hurt to look at. I stood there on the steps, clutching my folder, and let the sunlight warm my face. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something close to freedom. Evelyn handed me a copy of the ruling and said, "You'll get the official documents by mail. It's over." But she was wrong. It wasn't over. It was only beginning. The next week was a strange mixture of liberation and aftermath. I withdrew the remaining funds from the joint account and opened a new one in my own name. I canceled every automatic payment, every shared authorization, every polite little tether they had wrapped around my life. I even bought a new phone number. Daniel tried to call, of course. Dozens of times. I didn't answer. He sent messages ranging from apology to anger to guilt, but I ignored them all. I wasn't ready to hear his version of love again. Instead, I went to a used car lot 2 towns over, the same one I'd passed on my walks months before. The salesman, a round man with kind eyes, asked what I was looking for. "Something modest," I said. "Something mine." He showed me a silver Toyota, 10 years old, clean and sturdy. I ran my hand over the hood, and for a moment I could almost feel the pulse of it under my palm. Alive. Waiting. "I'll take it," I said, and paid in cash. The first drive was tentative at first, like reintroducing myself to a language I hadn't spoken in years. My hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, but the muscle memory came back quickly. The roads opened up in front of me, each turn erasing a little more of the helplessness that had clung to me for so long. I drove to the lake, parked under the willow tree, and sat there watching the water ripple. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I took the spare key from my pocket, the one from the old Honda that I had kept all this time, and placed it in the glove compartment of the new car. It was a small ceremony, a burial of sorts, a way of closing one life before stepping fully into another. But freedom, like all things worth having, demands maintenance. The following days brought new letters from Bright Care and polite emails from Daniel's lawyer asking to revisit the family's concerns. I deleted them without reading. I knew their tone, the mix of contrition and control, the offer to start fresh. They still didn't understand that I wasn't negotiating anymore. One evening, I sat at my desk and wrote a short, final note addressed to Daniel and Claire. It read, "I am safe. I am well. I do not need care. I need respect. Please stop contacting me. I wish you peace, but not access." I signed it, made a copy for my records, and mailed it. There was one more task left, the quietest, but perhaps the most important. I called the young clerk from the DMV, the one who had helped me restore my license, and thanked him. He sounded surprised. "You didn't have to call," he said. "Most people don't." I told him he had given me back more than a card. He had given me proof. Proof that I could still stand at a counter, sign my name, and be recognized as someone who mattered. He laughed softly, embarrassed, and said he was glad he could help. When I hung up, I realized that was the first purely kind conversation I'd had with a stranger in years. The following weekend, I drove to the farmer's market in town. The vendors greeted me like an old friend. I bought peaches, honey, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. It was such a small thing, shopping, but it felt like reclaiming a country I'd been exiled from. I even ran into Leah, my neighbor's daughter, who stared at the car with wide eyes. "You're driving again," she said. I smiled. I never stopped. I just took the long way back. That night, as I parked in the driveway, I looked at the silver car glinting in the dusk and felt something close to contentment, though not quite peace yet. There were still scars, anger that flared without warning, a wariness that shadowed even small joys. But beneath it all, there was strength. I knew the fight wasn't just for me. It was for every woman whose life had been quietly stolen under the guise of care, every mother turned into a problem to be solved. Before bed, I opened my notebook again and wrote. I stood in court, and they listened. They wrote my name where it belongs, beside the word plaintiff, not dependent. I did not win back a car. I won back a self. Then I closed it, turned off the light, and lay there, listening to the steady hum of the world outside. It was the sound of engines and wind and distant voices, the sound of life continuing. Somewhere in the dark, I could almost hear Peter's voice again, warm and steady, saying what he always said when I finally got what I deserved. "Well done, sweetheart. Drive safe." And for the first time in years, I slept without fear of waking to find my life missing. The day everything reached its true turning point began without warning, the way storms sometimes arrive beneath a sky that still pretends to be blue. I was at home, sitting by the window, sorting through a stack of envelopes that had accumulated on the counter. Bills, advertisements, one letter from the court confirming the closure of my case. I felt calm, almost weightless, like a leaf finally detached from the branch it had clung to for too long. The air outside smelled of rain, and the maple tree in front of my house had begun to shed its first golden leaves. It could have been an ordinary day, one of those quiet stretches of peace that follow a long war. And perhaps that was why I didn't expect the knock on the door. 3 sharp, official knocks, not the uncertain rhythm of neighbors or delivery men. When I opened it, a man in a suit stood on the porch holding a clipboard, and behind him, to my astonishment, stood Daniel. The man introduced himself as an evaluator from BrightCare, said they were conducting a follow-up wellness verification as part of the post-hearing transition. The words tasted bureaucratic, harmless, but the tone was firm, rehearsed. Daniel avoided my eyes, looking instead at the floorboards. For a moment, I didn't move. I felt the pulse in my neck, that deep, low drumming that always precedes a decision. "There's no verification to conduct," I said finally. "The court has already ruled. You have no authority here." The man smiled the way people do when they're trained not to show irritation. "We're simply here to ensure that you're managing safely, ma'am. It's for your protection." I took a breath. "I've had enough protection to last a lifetime," I said, and began to close the door. Daniel's hand shot out to stop it, not roughly, but with the desperate insistence of someone who still believed he could salvage control. "Mom, please," he said softly, and that single word, "please," unraveled something I had tried to keep tightly sealed. I stepped back and let them in, but only because I wanted the battle to end in my house, on my ground. They stood awkwardly in the living room while I sat on the sofa. The evaluator started asking questions in a careful, soothing voice. How I managed my medication, whether I cooked for myself, how often I left the house. I answered each one with measured patience, like a teacher humoring a dull student. Daniel hovered near the window, his hands buried in his pockets, his shoulders drawn up as if he were freezing. When the evaluator asked if there was any family assistance in my daily routine, I said, "There used to be. Now there's none. And that's the healthiest I've been in years." The man hesitated, scribbled something on his form, then asked to inspect the kitchen. I followed him there, watched as he opened drawers and cupboards like an uninvited guest. "You seem quite organized," he murmured. "That surprises you?" I asked. He didn't answer. When it was done, he thanked me in that falsely cordial tone bureaucrats use when they know they've failed to prove anything. He said he'd file his report and contact me if needed. "Don't," I said flatly. Then I turned to Daniel, who still hadn't spoken more than a handful of words. "Stay," I told him. "We need to talk." The evaluator left, and for a long moment we were silent. The air between us was thick with everything unsaid. The years of love and resentment, of misunderstanding disguised as care. Daniel looked older, I noticed. There were lines around his mouth that hadn't been there before, a kind of weary guilt that had replaced the self-assurance I once mistook for strength. He finally spoke. "I didn't know they'd come today. They told me it was just a routine visit. I didn't think—" "You never do," I interrupted. He flinched. "That's not fair, Mom." I stood up, feeling the blood surge through my legs like current. "Fair? You want fairness? You sold my car, forged my signature, decided I was too fragile to decide my own life. You stole from me and called it love." His face twisted, not with anger, but with something closer to shame. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. "You're my mother. I was scared. What if something happened to you?" I took a slow step closer. "Something did happen to me. You happened to me. You turned me into someone who had to prove she was alive." My voice rose, and I didn't care if the neighbors heard. For months I had been holding the words in, letting them grow like vines around my ribs, and now they tore free, one by one. Do you have any idea what that's like? To wake up every day knowing your own child has declared you incompetent? To look at your reflection and wonder if maybe they're right? I stopped then, breathing hard. He didn't answer. His hands were shaking slightly, and for the first time I saw not arrogance, but fear. Fear of what he'd done, of what he'd become. I walked to the small drawer where I kept my documents, pulled out the court ruling, and placed it on the table between us. This is the last time I explain myself. The law says I am capable. I know I am capable. You don't get to rewrite that. He stared at the paper but didn't touch it. I just wanted you to be safe, he whispered. You can't protect someone by erasing them, I said. You can only love them by trusting they know who they are. He looked up then, his eyes wet, his mouth trembling. I didn't mean to hurt you. But you did, I said softly. And meaning doesn't undo damage. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The house was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, steady and indifferent. Finally, he nodded once, like a man accepting a sentence. I'll leave you alone, he said. I promise. I didn't thank him. Promises from him meant little now. I just said, good. After he left, I sat on the sofa for a long time, feeling the silence expand around me until it was almost physical. It wasn't peace yet, but it was something close to it, a clearing, an aftermath. The evaluator's scent of cologne still lingered faintly in the air, mixed with the sharp tang of autumn coming through the open window. I looked at the court papers still lying on the table and realized they were more than proof. They were armor. I had fought, and I had not been defeated. But something inside me knew the real victory wasn't the ruling. It was this moment, this confrontation, this final unmasking of love's false language. I had given birth to that man, fed him, carried him through illness, fear, failure. And yet, here I was, standing alone, surviving his benevolence. That night, I took a drive. The roads were empty, the headlights slicing through the darkness in clean, narrow beams. I didn't have a destination, just the need to move, to remind myself that motion was still mine. I passed the old neighborhood where Peter and I had lived when the children were small, the park where Daniel had learned to ride his bike, the corner cafe that had closed years ago but still carried the ghost of its smell, burnt coffee and sugar. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the mirror. An old woman, hair silver under the dashboard glow, eyes sharp, mouth set in something that wasn't quite a smile. She looked like someone who had finally learned to live without apology. I turned onto the highway, the hum of the tires a kind of music, low and steady. With every mile, the weight lifted. I thought of the years I had spent deferring, softening myself for the comfort of others. I thought of all the quiet sacrifices women make in the name of peace, the slow disappearance that begins with good intentions. Somewhere along the way, I had mistaken compliance for kindness, silence for dignity, but not anymore. I drove faster, not recklessly, but with the certainty of someone who knows the road belongs to her again. The radio played an old song from the 70s, one Peter used to hum while shaving, and I found myself singing along, my voice rough but sure. Eventually, I pulled over by the lake, the same one where I had gone so many times before, and parked beneath the willow tree. The air was cool and still. The water shimmered under the moonlight, a mirror too deep to lie. I sat there for a long time, thinking of everything I had lost and everything I had reclaimed. The car, the house, the money, those were tangible victories. But the real triumph was quieter, harder to name. It was the return of something I hadn't realized I'd lost. Self-respect, yes, but also joy. The ability to inhabit my own life without permission. I took the old spare key from my bag, the one from the green Honda, and held it up to the moonlight. "You did your part," I whispered. Then I dropped it into the lake. It hit the surface with a soft plunk and vanished. Watching it sink, I felt an odd, weightless release, as if I had shed the last remnant of my captivity. When I drove home, the streets were empty, and the city lights blurred at the edges of my vision. I parked in my driveway, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment before getting out. The house stood quietly, the porch light glowing like a patient sentinel. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The papers on the table, the blanket folded neatly over the armchair. But it all looked different now, claimed. I poured myself a glass of water, stood by the window, and watched the wind ripple through the maple leaves. Somewhere deep inside, I felt the tremor of exhaustion that comes after survival. But beneath it, there was calm. The kind that comes when you realize there will be no more battles, only the slow rebuilding of an ordinary life. Before going to bed, I opened my notebook one last time. On the final page, beneath the earlier entries of anger and fear, I wrote in slow, deliberate script. Freedom is not returned by verdict or apology. It's taken back the moment you stop explaining yourself. I put down the pen and closed the book. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like someone's mother, patient, or project. I felt like myself, intact and indivisible. The storm had passed. What remained was not ruin, but space. Clear, vast, and finally mine. In the months that followed, the house settled into a new kind of quiet. Not the fragile silence of fear, but the calm that comes after reclamation. The steady hum of ordinary life restored. The days moved with a rhythm I recognized from long ago, back before every choice I made had to be justified to someone else. Mornings were simple again. I woke when I wanted, brewed coffee strong enough to taste like defiance, and sat by the kitchen window, watching the light creep across the floor. The maple tree outside had lost all its leaves by then, its branches bare and elegant against the winter sky. And sometimes, I thought it looked the way I felt, stripped of excess, but still standing. I spent my time writing letters I didn't send, cooking meals that filled the house with scents of butter and rosemary, reading the novels Peter and I used to argue about. I stopped checking my phone for messages. I stopped waiting for apologies. There comes a point in every woman's life when she realizes that waiting is the last form of obedience. And I had finished being obedient. Daniel did not call for a long time. I imagine he was nursing the kind of shame that doesn't announce itself but seeps in quietly, turning every small decision into a reminder of failure. Once in early spring, I saw his car slow down as it passed the house. He didn't stop. I watched from behind the curtain, and though part of me wanted to run out, to shout that I was still here, I didn't. Some silences are sacred. They protect what words can only bruise. I had said all that needed to be said. What remained between us now was distance, the honest kind, unadorned by pretense. I hoped, in some unspoken way, that he was learning to live with it, to understand that love without respect is only possession wearing perfume. My world became smaller but denser, filled with details that had once escaped me, the sound of the kettle clicking off, the faint creak of the floorboards as I walked from room to room, the way the sunlight shifted through the curtains depending on the season. Every detail felt like proof of existence, of presence. I began tending a small garden in the back, nothing ambitious, just herbs, a few tomatoes, lavender by the fence. There was a particular satisfaction in nurturing something that asked nothing of me but water and patience. In that slow growth, I found a kind of companionship. The plants did not question my capability. They only responded to care honestly given. Occasionally, letters would arrive from institutions still trying to fold me back into their systems. Care agencies offering preventative services, retirement communities advertising independent living, banks proposing joint protection plans. I would read each one carefully, then tear it in half and throw it away. It wasn't anger that made me do it. It was clarity. The world is full of people who think they know what's best for you. Most of them mean well. That doesn't make them right. Freedom, I learned, is not granted once and forever. It has to be maintained daily, like breath, like balance. Some days it was as simple as saying no. Other days it was just remembering that I could. The car became my small church of motion, the one place where I prayed by driving. I would take long routes to nowhere in particular, following roads I hadn't seen in decades. Sometimes I'd stop at a cafe on the outskirts of town where no one knew my name, order a cup of tea, and sit among strangers. I liked the anonymity of it, the sensation of being just another body in the world instead of a case to be managed. There was a sweetness in being unremarkable again, in belonging to no one's plan but my own. Once, an elderly man sitting near the window caught my eye and smiled. I smiled back. We didn't speak. That was enough. It was during one of those drives, on a windy afternoon in May, that I saw a small accident on the roadside. A young woman standing beside her stalled car, looking helpless and embarrassed. I pulled over and offered her a ride to the nearest service station. She accepted with the kind of shy gratitude that comes from not wanting to be a burden. As we drove, she told me she had just moved to the city for a new job, that she missed her grandmother terribly, that she worried about leaving her alone back home. She keeps saying she's fine, the girl said, laughing nervously. But you know how they are. Stubborn. I smiled, not unkindly. Maybe she's not stubborn, I said. Maybe she's just tired of being treated like a fragile miracle. The girl glanced at me, surprised, then nodded slowly, as if storing the words away for later. When I dropped her off, she thanked me and said, "You remind me of her." I watched her walk away, the wind tugging at her hair, and felt something warm bloom in my chest. Perhaps that was the point of surviving, not to be celebrated, but to become a quiet warning in someone else's story. That evening, I drove to the lake again. The water was calm, the air soft with the promise of summer. I parked under the willow tree, rolled down the window, and listened to the frogs singing. The reflection of the moon trembled on the surface of the lake, a fragile silver coin that refused to sink. I thought of Peter, of the life we built, of the boy Daniel once was, before fear made him cruel. I forgave him then, not out of obligation, but because I was finally free enough to do it without losing anything. Forgiveness, I've learned, is not reconciliation. It's simply the decision to stop carrying someone else's burden. I whispered his name into the wind, not as a curse, but as a release. Before I drove home, I wrote a letter to a woman I'd met briefly at the courthouse months earlier, a widow named Ruth, who had been fighting a similar battle against her son's guardianship petition. I still remembered her trembling hands clutching a folder, the look of quiet despair in her eyes. I wrote, "Dear Ruth, if they ever tell you that you need care, tell them this. Care without respect is captivity. You are not unfit. You are unheard. Make them listen." I signed it, sealed it, and decided to mail it the next morning. It felt like lighting a small candle for someone else to find their way by. When I returned home, the porch light was waiting for me, steady and golden. I sat in the car for a while before going inside, watching the faint reflection of my own face in the windshield. It looked older, yes, but also unmistakably alive. The lines around my mouth had softened. The eyes were clear, unashamed. I turned off the engine and stepped into the night air. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. Inside, I poured myself a cup of tea and opened the window. The breeze carried in the scent of lavender from the garden, and I realized with a kind of tender disbelief that I was content. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just quietly, solidly content. Sometimes when the phone rings, I still hesitate before answering, half expecting to hear Daniel's voice. But even if he does call again someday, I know I will not tremble. I will listen. I will be kind. And then I will end the call when I choose. The power to hang up, that small, ordinary gesture, has become my measure of freedom. As I write this now, the night deepens outside, the stars fading one by one behind the slow drift of clouds. Tomorrow will come like any other day, unremarkable and mine. And that, after everything, is the miracle I fought for. Not to be cared for, not to be managed, but simply to be left, at last, in peace.